Happy Europe Day 2022. Welcome, Your Royal Highness, Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands. Welcome, Mr. Arthur van Dijk, Commissioner for the King's Commissioner for the Province of North Holland. Welcome, Mrs. Marijke van Doornik, Deputy Mayor of Amsterdam. Welcome, Louis Vassy, Ambassador of France to the Netherlands. Welcome, Mrs. Devi van der Weert, Ambassador for Cultural Relations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Welcome, members of the Supervisory Board of the European Cultural Foundation. Welcome all of you here in the room at De Bali, and welcome everyone out there on the World Wide Web. And online, because this is live stream. That's why we had this counting here, and I'm very happy that you're all here for Europe Day 2022. We have heard many things today. We had discussions on the European sentiment, on the European public space, on the Europe challenge with the public libraries at OBA. And we heard a lot about the meaning of Europe Day today and in the past. And when I was thinking what to say, I thought everything is already said, so what should I repeat? And I don't want to repeat things. I only want to say that in the past, Europe Day was always a kind of a nice to have, something you did like Sunday speeches. You said some nice words for Europe on Europe Day. Hopefully you could do this during office hours and it wasn't a Sunday where you could actually go to the beach or so. So it was a procedural thing. It wasn't really a real thing. But this has changed dramatically. I think we have a very special Europe Day today, not because we did it or the European Culture Foundation. No, something happened, and we will talk about that too. I think this Europe Day 2022 is possibly one of the most important, maybe the most important Europe Day since its inception in 1950 of Robert Schuman and his Schuman Declaration. So with this, there will be much more talk, and we have a big list of speakers, and of course we have the keynote speech of Princess Laurentien, which I'm really looking forward to, and you too. But we also have a wonderful host here at the Bali, a friend and partner of the European Culture Foundation, and Juri Albrecht, who will take us through the whole day as a host. Juri, please join us and take us through this nice evening. Thank you.
Danke dir, André Wilkens, Director of the European Cultural Foundation. Very nice to be working together with the European Cultural Foundation. We've been doing this for many years, and it's always a great pleasure. And like you said, it's one of the more important moments for our European future to discuss. I will be trying to lead this conversation for over the next 2 hours. We have a host of important speakers. We have 3 packed panels, and that's only very logical because we are in Europe not only after a pandemic, but we are at war in our continent again. Maybe not the first time after the Second World War, but definitely the most devastating war we're witnessing. So it's a very, very, very topical moment to be speaking about cultural solidarity and future of the European project. I will be introducing the speakers later to you. I think we have some people joining us even from Ukraine by Zoom. We have Ukrainian artists, we have many thinkers. And I think the main thing we're going to talk about is, wasn't Europe meant to prevent war and make peace? Wasn't Europe about common values? And isn't that what we should be discussing now? And aren't values induced by culture? The only place where they come from, probably in the 21st century, is culture. It's the only way to induce a common values. The common values we try to uphold in the face of war and fascism. Very warm welcome. I would say the most important speaker of tonight is the introduction keynote speech by Princess Laurentien. Royal Highness Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands, very, very warm welcome to you, and give her a warm applause. She's speaking again on Europe, which is a great privilege to be listening to you.
I'm not sure that holds that I'm the most important speaker of the evening. I'm so looking forward to hearing from our friends in Ukraine. And I have to say that exactly 10 years ago, I stood here, actually on the other side of the room, in a similar spot, asking the audience to close their eyes and imagine the future of Europe. And I wonder how many people then imagined the world today. So I have to admit, I stand here with some trepidation, I would say. What would do my words, my personal words, matter when only a few thousand kilometers away, war is destroying lives, is destroying cities, is destroying dreams? And what does Europe Day mean in 2020? Andrei referred to it, and Yuri too. And in a year when war has returned to Europe. And yet we are here. It is Europe Day, and a day that traditionally celebrates peace and unity in Europe, here in Amsterdam and across the continent. So just a bit of historical context. Where does this Europe Day exactly come from? Where is the beginning? So Europe, as we know, is a continent of thinkers, of artists, of inventors, but also of warriors and demagogues. We have a great cultural heritage and have fought the most terrible wars in world history. Now, this duality is woven into the declaration that Robert Schuman published on the 9th of May, 1950, on this day, 72 years ago. And in that declaration it said, and I quote, "World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it." Schuman was convinced that concrete, visible, and tangible achievements could over time create a sense of solidarity. He believed in the solidarity of production, of creation, and of joint action. So this 72-year-old vision also gives us, hopefully, clues to address Europe's challenges today. Be short and precise, it said. Solve a real problem. Focus on the essence of power, interests, and sovereignty. Make a plan that delivers achievements. Don't just talk about solidarity, but create solidarity through action. And it very clearly said, start immediately. Now, the Schuman Declaration imagined lasting peace in Europe based on pooling of resources and sovereignty. This sounds basic, perhaps, but 72 years ago, this idea was equivalent to a moonshot. Because only 10 years after the Second World War, 6 countries, including, as you know, Germany, voluntarily came together to share sovereignty in the production of coal, steel, and nuclear energy, thereby internationalizing the hardware of war and creating the basis for sustainable peace, security, and prosperity across Europe. Now, what is sometimes forgotten that this was also a response to the external challenge from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. It's rarely mentioned in the promotional story of the European project, but it's important to remember this in the context of today. So these 6 countries became the founding fathers of the European Union. Now, we seldom talk about politics as being creative, unfortunately. But as you can imagine, this was truly creative and imaginative. The Schuman Declaration and the subsequent creation of the European Union was the most creative political project of the 20th century. Schuman and his colleagues imagined it and made it happen. An idea, a vision that delivered long-lasting peace and prosperity, not only on paper, but in real life. But that was then. Over the years, we took peace in Europe for granted, as Yuri also already referred to. We've been so used to living in peace that we could not imagine that there won't be peace. It made us skeptical of voices warning us that polarization could lead to war. And while some took peace for granted, others prepared for war. And in recent years, it became fashionable to wonder about the purpose and future of the European project. This underscores the need to express the narrative of the European Union of peace and solidarity. We should do so forcefully and in a way that young people will not only understand, but also embrace. We should listen to young people and take them seriously. And we must defend our shared values. We cannot take them for granted. So let's come back to Europe Day. What is there then to celebrate if we realize where we stand today? We've got to be honest. The European Union is far from perfect, but it still is the best political, geopolitical, economic and social and cultural construct we ever invented. It's work in progress, the European Union, and in the best sense of the term. And yes, it's been difficult, and yes, it has never been easy. United in diversity, the European Union will show its strength. But we have achieved a lot, a dynamic and prosperous region based on these shared values that connect us. So I do believe that we should take once a year to celebrate the European Union and the creative idea which brought us together. And let's not give in to the warmongering and into the people who want to turn back the wheel of history. And this time, indeed, let's celebrate our Ukrainian friends who are currently defending their freedom with their very own lives. And let's commemorate all those who have given their lives. Let's remind ourselves today that European peace, cooperation and solidarity are as relevant today as they are 72 years ago, and that they cannot be taken for granted. So in fact, indeed, today, Europe Day 2022 is probably the most important moment since its inception. And we have to continue to imagine a better Europe. So what about this role of culture? Well, the European Cultural Foundation here based in Amsterdam was created in 1954 with the mission to grow a European sentiment through connecting local realities and initiatives with the European mission through culture and education. And in the midst of the corona crisis, we took kind of like a stock of this mission. How much of a European sentiment is there across Europe, and how far does it reach beyond the Brussels belt? Now, as part of this reflection, the European Cultural Foundation and the European Council of Foreign Relations conducted a study on the state of the European sentiment. We proudly present the results of this European Sentiment Compass today. And the good news is that it is showing a growing European sentiment also in the Netherlands. So clearly, the corona crisis and the war in Ukraine, it unites us. That is a strength, of course. But I have to say, it feels somewhat ironic that if it takes a pandemic and a war to make Europeans feel European, that is why the study points to the importance of those shared values, shared cultures, and a shared public and media space. Robert Schuman, Prince Bernhard, and the other founders of the European Cultural Foundation envisage a Europe where citizens feel proudly European. A place where they can live, express themselves, work and dream freely, in diversity, inclusivity, and in harmony. They knew that it could not be enough to share the hardware of war, but we also need to share the creative power of culture, the software of peace. So that begs the question, Are we up to the creative challenge Robert Schuman imagined? I believe we are. Artists and cultural figures are drivers of change. They give hope in times of anxiety. They provide resistance against dictators and lies. They keep the connection across polarized lines. They imagine a better Europe beyond war, spheres of influence, polarization, and simplistic talk of growth rates. They can help save Europe from nostalgia for 20th century nationalism. Investing in arts and culture in times like these is an investment in our common culture and our common future. Cultural actors and artists create spaces that push us to imagine new ideas and possibilities. They are well aware of the discomfort they create by challenging the status quo, to the point of being labeled naive, irrelevant, political, or worse, extremist. But it's their independent mind that drives them. Culture can create Europe-wide experiences. Such shared experiences create a sense of belonging, a shared sense of purpose in Europe. And for the past 67 years, the European Cultural Foundation has been a firm advocate of a Europe grounded in culture. And it has supported those who, even in the most complex and difficult socio-political contexts, strive to express their own vision of Europe. Artists, cultural workers, and heritage professionals in Ukraine, elsewhere in Europe, and even in Russia itself, were among the most forceful voices to warn against Putin's aggression, condemn it, call for defiance and resistance, often at the risk of their own lives. There has been much support to Ukraine, economically, military, and humanitarian. Culture can substantially add to these efforts, being inspirational and vital to everyday lives. It provides hope, strength, and resilience. And we need to build on the capacity of culture to heal, bring communities together, and imagine a way forward. There is now clearly an urgency to support cultural initiatives that, in the midst of turmoil and crisis, reinforce European solidarity and provide hope and creativity for a shared future in peace. Now, what do we do at the European Cultural Foundation? In honor of former ECF President Prinses Margriet of the Netherlands, the European Cultural Foundation hosted 11 successful editions of the Prinses Margriet Award for Culture, the annual award for inspiring people and organizations who imagined new paths for Europe. The award has brought forward many important and esteemed laureates, and two of them are participating in this Europe Day tonight. Vasil Cherepanin of Kiev, based Visual Cultural Research Center, and Charles Esche, director of the Van Abbe Museum, who both, in their own ways, encourage critical thinking and radical imagination. Now, with the blessing of Princess Margriet as patron and namesake of the award, the European Cultural Foundation has developed the award into a fund that addresses the many challenges that Europe is now facing. So we go from an award to a fund. And this Culture of Solidarity Fund supports cultural solidarity in Europe in moments of turmoil and crisis. And it addresses the urgency of today with a focus on the power of culture to unite and mobilize. And to give an example, 2 days after the start of the war in Ukraine, the Culture of Solidarity Fund launched a Ukraine edition. The fund is now supported by a coalition of over 10 European foundations and growing. And until now, over €1 million, more than 50 projects were supported, including evacuation of art collections, providing safe spaces for artists, and countering misinformation and war propaganda. But of course, this is a drop in the ocean of what is required. We need much more. Investing in arts and culture in times like these is an investing in our common future based on solidarity. So to end, culture is the software of building a better Europe. Europe Day 2020 is a day to appreciate what we can achieve if we work together creatively, with focus and urgency. Europe Day should inspire us to be as imaginative as the founding fathers of the European Union were. And may we take inspiration from the late Polish leader Lech Walesa, who said, and I quote, "The sole and basic source of our strength is the solidarity of people who seek to live in dignity, truth, and in harmony with their conscience." The question is, are we all individually and collectively up to this challenge? We'd better be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for introducing us to the topic of tonight. 10 years ago, yeah, that's already a long time ago. And talking again on this topic, you could. I'm not going to ask you how you feel about 10 years and now, but you could say that there's a good thing in it, that we no longer need to explain the necessity of a vital and vibrant European Union. But that's just trying to pour some hope out of the fact that there's a war going on, and that I don't know whether that's appropriate or not, but thank you for staying the course for so long on the European topic, which I think by now we know that it's vitally important. And thank you for your speech, and thank you for the quotation from Lech Walesa, I think you should say. I interviewed him twice. What a wonderful man. I'd like to start with the first panel. We have 3 rounds of speakers, so we are a little bit in a hurry. I will introduce every panel when we started, and I will first ask Sofia Bulgakova, Olivier Guès, and Giuliano D'Empoli to join me here at the table. Very warm welcome to all 3 of you. Come volete. Grazie. Welcome. Let's start. Sofia Bulgakova is an art scientist and interdisciplinary artist born in Odessa, Ukraine, and currently based in The Hague in the Netherlands. Welcome to you. Olivier Guès, a French journalist, essayist, and writer who recently wrote Le Grand Tour. I think that was an English invention, but it sounds better in French, actually, Le Grand Tour.
I think it was French.
It was French?
And taken by the English.
Taken by the English. Oh, okay.
It's an old tradition by the Brits.
But anyway, you wrote a book on the same...
Well, I directed a book.
Yeah. A self-portrait of Europe through the eyes of many writers. Yeah, that's in that sense you could say direct, yes, because it's in cooperation with a lot of European writers. And Giuliano D'Empoli, an Italian and Swiss writer and director, founder of Volta, a Milan and Brussels-based think tank, the author of the 7 Ideas for a European Cultural Recovery, just very recently, very practical as well. A paper recently published, let's say, where I have it here. Yeah, 7 Ideas for a European Cultural Recovery Plan. And it's very practical, and actually to quote the princess, and who was quoting Schumann, start immediately. Which was very good advice, I think. Start immediately. If we take stock a little bit on our cultural position at this moment and the sort of the dark clouds which are covering it, let's start immediately. 7 Ideas for a European Cultural Recovery Plan. What's the most important one? You.
Well, put like that. Well, first of all, that was written a couple of years ago, and it looks like it was already like, as was just said, you know, it looks like it was an era away. It was written in completely different conditions. My main worry at the time was that I was starting from a very basic fact, which is that you can't sell a book or a cultural product in Europe that has Europe in its title because Europe is boring. So it used to be boring. And so I was looking for ways, and my idea was that Europe had somehow a culture of boredom when it comes to, and that culture of boredom wasn't accidental. It was something that we had developed throughout the years and even the decades, because Europe somehow had to be boring, because it had been so passionate, and it had led to, I mean, kind of a difficult position here, because I don't want to be rude, but so I don't want to, I'd like to face the audience, but at the same time I'm not really well placed.
There are many people looking through that lens.
Okay, so
there's many people at home looking at you.
So maybe for the second panel I'll change seats. So that was a bit the idea behind it. And of course, in the meantime, what happened now is that Europe isn't boring anymore. You know, and
that's the good news.
And that's not really good news, and that's a scary part of it, because and also that's also something that we have to be a bit scared of. We're all part of a bubble. You know, people who are here tonight, they're obviously, we always talk about filter bubbles and stuff, and the national populists, you know, they're in their bubble, and they only listen to all kind of news and stuff. But we obviously also are. And that's a European bubble, and you know, we believe in Europe in a very strong way, but we also have some beliefs that are not really shared by a broad majority of the population, or at least of the European population. And I think one of the really scary things I've seen over the last maybe 3 months, I mean, since the war started, is this, and before with COVID, this kind of European policy wonk glee, because, you know, finally we're getting together, and finally, yeah, Germany's decided to invest 2% of its budget on military expenses, and finally everybody got it. You know how important it is that we are going back into history and not anymore into this post-historical dimension where we used to live in, and where we thought that every conflict could be managed and dealt with legal agreements and contracts and trade agreements, and we're back into history. But all this, I think, is part of the scary part of what we're going through. And I understand that from a European policy wonk perspective, it might be a good thing, because you finally have all kind of ways and incentives to do things, but it's scary. And also at the same time, I don't think we should overestimate the European sentiment. Even the very interesting research that was presented before, it tells us something very clear. I mean, yes, of course. I mean, first of all, people don't care so much about Europe. They didn't care so much about Europe before, and they care a little bit more now, within a broader existential crisis, between a much broader realignment. And this opens a window of opportunity for Europe. There's no doubt that the window of opportunity is there. But we also have many chances to waste that. And we are still moving in an environment that is very uncertain and very worrisome. today, and then I can take the floor and keep talking. So I will obviously stop at one point.
We have ample time here, but
yeah.
But I was asking you, what would be the most important advice if you say 7 ideas? Which, if you have to pick one? So you're saying it's scary because there's a return of history, because we can do things wrong. Yes, we can, but we can do things right as well. So if we have to choose one.
Yeah, well, for example, the second one, since Olivier is somehow representing the first one, because the first one was kind of inspired by the Roosevelt New Deal. He had a writer's project, and that was a big project for like actually making a self-portrait of Europe done by writers and artists and stuff. But Olivier's project is somehow along those lines. So I will maybe leave it to him to talk about that. But I think that's really crucial, actually, what he's doing. But the second one, just to follow the order, is...
We're not going to do all 7.
No, I'm just going to do the second one, and just for like 35 seconds. And it actually comes from a quote by Stefan Zweig, who was invited at the Paul Valéry conference in 1933 about the spirit of Europe in Paris. And he actually was underlining 33 is obviously a crucial year in European history, and how much weaker and less passionate and less appealing the European idea was in comparison to the resurgence of nationalist impulses that was taking place back then. And of course, we're witnessing this again, and we're, for example, witnessing on social media. And we're witnessing in the social media environment, and this was even true before, of course, before the last phase. And so the idea was a meme factory for Europe. And the way it's done, for example, in Taiwan they have to face a very, they're just in front of China, and they're defending this fragile democracy in front of this Chinese behemoth. And they're so smart in harnessing even social media and ways of communicating in a passionate and involving way their messages. And Europe is so bad at this, so it's so banal to say it here again. To say it in front of this audience is almost redundant. But that was one of the ideas that I think was important.
A meme factory, yeah. And that might be a task for artists and creatives, at least. We tried to do the same thing a few years ago here in the Bali by making a Eurolab with Wolfgang Tielemans and Rem Koolhaas, generating images done by artists to counter and to deepen the idea of Europe. I can't say we've been very, very effective with it, but although we worked for a whole week with 40 people from all over Europe with it.
That might not be enough.
The task for artists, if I can come to you, Sofia.
Of course.
Kova, maybe first, you are an artist.
I am.
You're working with your own creativity. And making things yourself. How did you manage to live through 2 years of lockdowns and COVID as an artist? Was it a creative period, or was it?
I got stuck in Ukraine for the first 2 months of pandemic. So I was in Kiev actually when everything started, and I came to Kiev with a crew of Dutch artists. Well, they almost arrived. I arrived a week before to do a project in Ukraine, in Kiev, in Mistecki Arsenal, which is the old weapon arsenal, and now it's a contemporary art museum. And we were about to start a project, and then the lockdown started a day they're supposed to be arriving. So I got stuck in, and they got stuck out in Netherlands. So my lockdown started with a big disappointment because the project never happened. And I got stuck with my parents for 2 months.
Oh my God.
It was a great addition. For me, somehow, lockdown was a lot about writing and grant applications and about preparing projects more than realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting in pandemic for me, I had a residency with Izolatia, which is an art center currently in Kiev, but which is originally from Donetsk, and they've been now for 7 years in exile in Kiev, because the space is occupied, and it's a torture place in Donetsk where they used to be residing. And then they were doing a program during pandemic, which was supposed to be a big residency.
Was that a coincidence, or was that done on purpose to turn an art space into?
I actually don't know this. It's called Isolation, the space, and now it's still called Isolation.
Grim.
But the project was called Landscape as a Monument, and it was focused on Donbas region and Donbas landscape and re-understanding it, which was great in pandemic. We actually could have people from Donetsk joining the conversation and joining the residency, and artists who were in Donetsk, in the military state, who were having curfews back then and being in a very oppressed situation. They could join and actually participate. We had lots of artists from Ukraine and international artists, and that was a great pandemic experience, because it actually connected me to back home and to the area which I'd never been in Ukraine. And we were developing a project regarding exactly the places you cannot be physically present. And we did an AR project with workshops with Ukrainian people and people from the Donetsk area, which never got released in the end, but it was a great process of discovery. So that was my great pandemic experience, which I would never be able to experience without it.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm asking you about the pandemic, and then there's suddenly, well, there was a war a long time, but for us there's suddenly a war. Does that, would you say, working with a Donetsk art space, or would you say that it's a big change for you, or is it just that we European Union Europeans just realized that there's a war going on? Is it for you a big difference?
Well, we cannot say that the war just started. Wouldn't be correct. For me, of course, it's a huge change. We knew what was happening. I was 16 when Maidan was going on, and then I lived in Kiev with my parents, and then our apartment building and my parents' restaurant is on Maidan Square. So I've been there for a whole year. That was another experience. That was a lot, and it was very visible. And then there's also, again, there was European and universal attention to this, and then it's kind of disappeared and dissolved. And there was still problems, but you also could not really feel it in the country or in the cultural sector. It was keep happening. It was very active. So of course now it's a huge change. And for me, it's as difficult as for me. It's also as difficult as for you. It's also very new.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we knew that something could happen, and of course it was not super easy, yes, but it's totally different right now.
Yeah, yeah. And if we talk about Europe Day and actually what, will this bring maybe, and I might be a policy wonker, European policy wonker, would this bring, back sort of a moment in which we realize that we can actually use Europe that's there for a purpose, or is it way too early in your mind to talk about sort of those kind of things?
I have to say, I'm still processing the fact that the 9th of May, it's a victory day for post-Soviet Union, so, and also because of all the attachment to the to the Second World War, everybody was waiting for every kinds of actions today in Ukraine.
Yeah, from Russia. From Russia.
Yeah. We were expecting, and now I'm originally from Odessa. Odessa has been bombed since yesterday and today constantly. I keep getting notifications on my phone and it keeps happening, and we were all expecting something. There are parades happening in occupied territories, victory parades for Second World War. So in contrast with this, sitting here in the Europe Day in the Bali, it's quite interesting. So that's very polarizing.
You use a sort of a neutral word, interesting. And would you say it's Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because you say it's polarizing. In what way?
It's just two realities.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we can talk about European solidarity and we can talk about things which will matter a little bit later,
Mm-hmm.
or which still matter, and we need to support Ukraine and Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian heritage and Ukrainian artists right now.
Mm-hmm.
But then sometimes, for me at least, it's as important as what I do. I'm involved in culture, but sometimes it feels a bit less urgent than I get notifications about bombings.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bit of a discrepancy on my feelings regarding these topics, and also what we're talking about Europe and European solidarity today and what we can do. Sometimes it's like, I don't know where to look first, to what exactly happening right now and how to manage this, or how we can actually build the future.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of,
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
it's a bit of my question, not really an answer, but something I'm...
Sorry.
It's more my question than an answer. I'm a bit puzzled by this.
Yeah, but questions are maybe more important than answers, because it will bring us maybe to ideas and places which we need to develop.
Exactly. That's also why we're here today, to talk and question and think together what we can do for the future and for Europe.
Yeah. And you're saying Ukrainian art and culture.
Yeah.
Would you equate Ukrainian art and culture to European, or is that something, two different things, or is it one thing? Or
I hope so. I really hope so.
What do you hope?
That it's European.
Yeah.
That we are part of this context. And as we see now and here today, we talk a lot about Ukraine. So finally we recognize Ukraine as part of the European context.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not always the case.
No.
A lot when we refer to, say, Europe, we refer to European Union, where Ukraine is not part of, or we disregard post-Soviet spaces, of post-Soviet countries. We discard Belarus, which is also European. We discard Moldova, which is also Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's great, and it's not great because it happens. It's being accepted because of the war and all this, what's going on right now, but it needs to be part of the European conversation. And it needs to be focused that it's part of Europe and it's part of European culture.
Yeah, it's part of European space, and it's not post-Soviet space, it's European
Exactly.
space. Yeah.
Exactly, and it also needs to be referred as not post-Soviet, as Ukrainian, as Belarus, as separated, not to, again, to kind of put an umbrella over it, which also has a connotation with being part of Russia, and just kind of continue this narrative about Soviet times, which has to be very clearly separated and respected within European context.
Mm-hmm. 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 And if it comes to the meme fabric, the idea of countering the totalitarian moment we're in, or the totalitarian narratives which are being pushed around maybe by a big tech or by big states, and Taiwan is an impressive example of as long as they not at war, but at the moment it's an impressive example. But would you and I think a lot depends on how Europe and the world reacts to what's happening to Ukraine for the future of Taiwan, but that's a different topic. What would you think that there's space, or there's a possibility for artists to participate or partake in something like a meme fabric or countering totalitarian narratives?
I think there's a lot of happening, actually. There's a lot of art being created. There's a lot of it also on social media, on Instagram use of it. It happens with the response of war, or images, or constructed narratives and images created by artists to process certain events or process certain information, which is actually very useful in communicating and reflecting on particular events. There's good examples of this, of artists from Odessa, Ekaterina Lisavenko, who does a lot about rape and what's happening in Ukraine from a female perspective. And there's Alevtina Kahidze, who does fantastic, also they're very meme-like images and drawings representing particular events which are happening now. So there's, of course, it's happening a lot, and it's great to have artists actually reflecting and working and being able to produce works in this time and actually be very spot on regarding this, and having it first-hand experience of their being in Ukraine.
Yeah, so yes, there.
Yes, there is. Yes,
there-
it's a
there-
simple answer. Yes.
There is a possibility, maybe.
There
yeah.
is a possibility,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do participate if you want to break the conversation. But Olivier, if I'm not mistaken, you've tried to draw a self-portrait of Europe in a artistic way. Is that a correct way of describing your project?
It's not wrong.
It's not
Really
wrong.
correct.
Okay, that's a good start.
Well, I asked, I mean, this is for the French presidency of the Council of the European Union. And this book would never have been possible without the French presidency, because an editor,
now, at this moment,
which is
yeah.
now till the end of June, because an editor would never have invested so much money. Because as Giuliano said, if you write about Europe, basically you have more or less no chance to sell any book.
Mm-hmm.
So without public funding, such a book, unfortunately, wouldn't be possible. That said, I asked 27 authors, one author per member state, to write a text, non-fiction, fiction text, about a place in their own country which has a relationship, a link to European culture or European history. And otherwise they were completely free. So they would choose a place, something personal, something more historical, a lieu de mémoire, everything was possible. And at the end you have 27 texts, and they tell a kind of the reality, or maybe the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time before the war. I think this is very important. I think they tell us what was the mindset of Europe at the end of a time which started the 9th of November 89 with the fall of the wall. 32, 33 years after, what was the state of mind of Europe? And I was very lucky because, I asked these authors, but I couldn't control. They're free. You were asking artists about Mem Factory, and I think when you give freedom to artists, they produce things. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I was very lucky because they produce very good texts. And basically you can divide, there are 7 chapters in the book, Le Grand Tour, but basically you have 2 main parts. The first one, I was surprised, I was not surprised. It's about the ghosts of the 20th century. The monsters of Europe. Some texts deal about the Holocaust, some texts deal about the communist time in Eastern Europe. This cultural genocide which happened in Eastern Europe that we, Western Europeans, didn't recognize enough, I think. We can speak about this later, but I think this is very important. The Italian writer writes about fascism, the Portuguese writer writes about, not only, but part of the text is about slavery. The Cypriot writes about the invasion by the Turks in 1974. So basically all the monsters of European history. And the rest, because there is a second part, it's about, I would say, the common places of Europe. Basically, all the things which defined the European landscape, the train station, the museum, the archaeological site, the cafes, of course, the sea resort, all these kind of things that you find everywhere in Europe. So you have these 2 parts, and basically it gives you a kind of a precise idea of the European landscape and also European memory before the war. Mm-hmm. Always precise this because the book was produced at the second semester of 21, and it was just published 1 week after the beginning of the war.
So it's 1989 until 2022.
This is what I think, yeah.
Yeah.
This is what I think. And when
Let's hope that 22 is not as an ominous date as 1933, but still, it's a big change.
Well, we don't know, but for sure, this is a big change in European history. It's a big change in history because we have, for something like 30 years, we didn't know exactly where we were going. And we didn't know who were our enemies. we have to recognize that, I mean, the Schuman Declaration, everything which happened between the 50s and the end of the 80s, I mean, we had a common enemy, which was the Soviet Union. And without this common enemy, Europe would have not grown that quickly. I mean, that was a very strong pressure. And during 30 years, we were in a kind of a void. We didn't know exactly where to go, what to do. I mean, at least the head of state. And basically, there was no big project in Europe between the 90s.
It looked like Francis Fukuyama was right. So we're sort of in between, end of history, no purpose.
I don't know if Fukuyama was right,
no,
but
it looked like. Yeah.
But I mean, Europeans wanted to believe in Fukuyama, and I think the Europeans were the only one to believe in Fukuyama because it was very practical, basically. I mean, the idea was to become.
That's very nicely put. Yeah.
The idea was to become a big Switzerland. I mean, rich, people can travel, people can consume. Basically, we are the Americans to protect us, but we don't really
nice
need
watches, chocolate, and bankers.
Exactly, and money, and travel, and leisure, and pleasure, and all this kind of easy life, this EasyJet way of life. We believed, most of people believed or wanted to believe in it. Even if there were, I mean, this period maybe lasted 10 years, basically the 90s. But with what happened on September 11, there was a clear message. I mean, the world is dangerous, and I've always been dangerous. But we still wanted to believe in this.
Nobody really heard it, no.
We didn't want to, because it was very practical. And it's also easier to sell for elections. Of course.
And coming back to your project and the way Giuliano put it, because he said I pressed him to choose one thing which would be.
Yeah,
really
I read his
practical.
paper.
And then
before.
The first one, a self-portrait. Yes. Maybe your your project would be a good example of it. Why is it so important to have a self-portrait?
Well, it's very. I mean, I think it's kind of easy, I would say.
Would you agree with that? It's very important, and why would it be important?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not important, considering what I've done.
No, exactly. That's why I'm asking you.
No, but what is very important, I think, what was built since the 50s is a very practical, economic, a bit political, little bit military union. But it's not a union made of flesh, of faces, of landscapes, of pleasures. I mean, this part of Europe was completely given up. I mean,
the part which is about
the very idea of a daily Europe somehow. We have a Europe which is very good for business, which is an amazing creation of rights and legal stuff. It's a very interesting political object. Not easy to define, but it's a very interesting political object. And maybe it's going to be a military power, maybe. We hope so. But that's one thing. The other thing is Europe on a daily basis. What is Europe for us? Europe is a reality. But the creation which was created, I mean, the last 70 years, was not made out of this. I mean, I always give a few examples. Our banknotes. I mean, this is crazy.
The euro banknotes.
Yes, exactly. What do we have on our banknotes?
Fake bridges.
Nothing. A void.
Yeah.
Why?
A computer
exactly.
Styled fake bridges.
Yeah. I mean, this is a neurosis. I mean,
it's
a neurosis.
Yeah.
It's completely neurotic.
What's so neurotic about this example?
I mean,
I think I understand you, but it's nice
yes, but you can't go anywhere if you don't know where you're from. I mean, when you start a psychoanalysis, this is the beginning, the very, 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 very beginning. Just say who you are, and then maybe you will know better where you're going. We don't want to know where we're from.
So that's why we need a self-portrait.
We know. But this was not defined by the European Union. The European Union doesn't want to touch all these issues, strangely.
Yeah.
So basically we have a void. I will also give another example.
It's a wonderful example. It makes it very clear.
It's a very, very important. Yeah. I mean, Europe produced hundreds, thousands of genius. Thousands.
Of what?
Of geniuses. Musicians, writers,
geniuses.
painters.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
All kind of geniuses.
Yeah.
And we decided to put fake bridges on our banknotes. This is crazy.
Interesting choice. Yeah.
And I mean, it says everything about the European project till now. I mean, why don't we have Mozart or Beethoven or whoever?
Foucault or whatever.
I mean, whoever. I mean, we could also have a kind of a game on internet. I mean, to choose the people who want our banknotes, for instance. That would be a possibility. I give you another example. In Brussels, there is a statue which is supposed to be the symbol of the European adventure.
Adventure.
What is this statue about? You have a blind guy falling into the void. L'homme qui marche. This is amazing. I mean, in America, you have the Statue of Liberty, and we have in Europe a blind guy falling into the void. What does it mean? I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, this is part of the European neuroses. I mean, in 2005, when they prepared the Constitution of Europe, all the heads of states fought for months and months about the European heritage. I mean, is it so difficult to speak about our heritage? I mean, you just need to walk around Europe, drive along Europe, and it's very easy to define. And that doesn't mean, I mean, of course we were Christians, but we're not only Christians, we're also a bit Muslims in the southeast and the southwest of Europe. Then there was the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment and so on and so on. I mean, this is a fantastic transnational history. Why wasn't it put in the treaties? Why are we so afraid of ourselves? And I think this is, I mean, the book is a little piece about this. I mean, just to give faces, fates, landscapes about this, the reality of Europe. This is very important. And this is, I think, the only way how we, all these people here around, because we're all pro-Europeans or Europeans, will touch the other parts of the population, which doesn't feel concerned by Europe, or which even think that Europe is a kind of antagonistic to them. We live, I mean, the princess talked about a narrative. There is no European narrative for now. And this is what is missing, one of the biggest things which is missing. So this auto-portrait is an embryo of this ambition, I would say.
Very well and nicely explained why it's important to have a self-portrait, to know yourself, to know where you're coming, instead of, you know, thinking that you're coming from nowhere. Actually, L'Homme qui marche, they might as well have put the wonderful statue by Rodin, L'Homme qui marche. It's a wonderful statue. It's in his museum in Paris. They could have put it there.
For instance.
It's called L'Homme qui marche.
But the other one doesn't march very well.
Yes, I think you were raising your finger at one point. I don't want to cut you short.
No, because I think what's important about what Olivier is saying is that to do what he's doing and to do a self-portrait of Europe that means something, you have to accept conflict. You have to accept transgression. You have to accept that some people will get mad. You have to accept that the picture will not necessarily be pretty or that everybody will agree. You have to accept, if you want to put a face on a banknote, you have to accept that some people will disagree and they will say, why did you put this guy instead of this woman or this other person? And this is what the European Union's been wanting to avoid, of course. So they've been looking for this kind of neutral identity where, you know, you have an hymn but you don't have words, and so many examples could be made of this. But this produces no energy, basically. And so what happens is that the only ideas that have energy and produce energy and debate a thing are the nationalist and the other narratives. And the European idea, because it's refusing conflict, because it's refusing all that. That's why also, you know, when Olivier says we have a longer history, of course we have a longer history, and that's, Luc van Middelaar's been writing about this, you know, we pretend that European history started in 1950, and that's actually what we're celebrating today. But of course, European history didn't start in 1950. But the problem is, if you go back, if you go further back,
it becomes
then
problematic
all kind
and you
of
need to discuss it.
Of course, terrible problems come up.
Yeah.
So it's easier to pretend that European history started in 1950. But if you only pretend that, then you're lacking so much of the whole, and you're now facing other forces, both political, nationalist, even within Europe and outside Europe, that are mobilizing all those forces and energies and things. And if we're still in this kind of shallow understanding of what Europe means, both in historical terms and in dialectical kind of conflict ways, well, we just won't have enough energy and won't be able to mobilize enough passion to counter those narratives.
Yuri, if I can say something, I think this is very important, what Giuliano is saying. The European project is very dated. It's a pure 80s project. I mean, the economical part of it, which is the biggest part, is a pure 80s thing. What happened since the 80s, I mean, of course, we had the globalization. The globalization created a huge identity crisis everywhere. And because the European wants to remain completely neutral, as if it was, a project coming from space without hurting anyone, anytime.
Without any smell or...
Basically, this identity crisis is fooled, this void is fooled by the populists, by the nationalists. And this is a huge problem. And you have two parts in this problem. The first part is this neoliberal thing, this neoliberal way of seeing the world from the 90s. Basically, culture was something that you could sell like anything else. But you didn't need to think about it, what it was. And basically, this is how cultural services work in the European Union. This is the main idea. On the other side of the spectrum, the left, at that time, 80s, 90s, beginning of the 21st century, didn't dare to speak about identity. Identity was a bad word. Basically, you couldn't speak about identity, you couldn't speak about civilization. You were perceived not as a fascist, but not far as a fascist. So basically, you had this void. On the right, you were thinking about money, about business. On the left, you couldn't think or say too much about identity. So what happened? In the void, of course, the nationalists took power of this identity. And now we're running after the extreme right everywhere in Europe, because some didn't dare to speak or some were not interested. And the European Union is not filling this void, because it's a shallow project in that perspective, because they have so much fear about hurting anyone. We have the most delicate heads of state in the world. They don't want to hurt anyone. They don't want to hurt each other within the union. They don't want to hurt anyone outside. This is crazy. And we need a narrative. And basically, when we think about this, I mean, all this European project was created, of course, because of the second 30 years war, 1914, 1945. But our history can just lead to this period. I mean, we have a very long European history where we did some fantastic things in Europe. This idea of transgression is very important for the European culture. And I mean, we have transgression from paganism to Christianity to Enlightenment. We have this transgression of, in literature, the invention of irony, for instance. But we have also the bad aspects of transgression, the transgression of nature with industry. This is a question mark. We have this transgression of other cultures with imperialism. But this very idea of transgression is extremely interesting. I mean, basically everything is there. And at a certain time, I hope that the heads of state and the parliamentarians and we from the civil society will dare to use all this part. I mean, just to speak about this identity, just to create debates, and then to transmit this history through education, which is very important. I think it's crazy that 72 years after the Schuman Declaration, We still don't have a common, I don't know, European civic education course in Europe. At least 1 hour for every kid in Europe. I mean, just the basics of European history. This is crazy.
So there's a lot to do, and I like to widen where to start. I like to widen this discussion and going into the very urgent and topical war in Ukraine, and invite 2 more speakers to the table in the panel. There's Maria Labajova. A very warm welcome to you, Maria. If you can join us here. Founder and artistic director of BAC, Contemporary Art Center in Utrecht. Welcome. One of your well-known projects is the former West. I remember very well. Welcome, and also Vasil Cheripanim. I can see you over there at the screen, Vasil. Very warm welcome to you as well. Can you see and hear us, Vasil?
Yeah, perfectly. And do you hear me well?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we can. Vasil Cheripanim holds a PhD in philosophy and has lectured at the National University in Kiev, joining us from the Ukraine right now. Also the head of the Visual Cultural Research Center, which indeed is one of the laureates. You are one of the laureates of the Princess Margriet Award, and also a curator of the Kiev Biennale. Welcome to you, Vasil. Good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while, and you still look the same, which is good to see. Maybe, Vasil, can I start out with you on the other end of our continent? If you were listening in to most of the earlier conversation, and I was wondering, from outside of the European Union, but from very much inside the European culture, you know, how do you listen to this conversation and about the sort of tasteless and cultural identity without any smell we've been building around the whole idea of a European Union? Would you agree with that, or and how do you look upon that?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, let me, Your Royal Highness, my dear colleagues, friends and partners, I'm really very delighted that you are having also me tonight. And first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude because I perceive my participation as a genuine solidarity gesture. So thank you very, very much. So with regards to identity and culture, this discussion has been circulating around. I would like to make, just using this opportunity again, to make several points, since I'm not sure that I can interrupt the debate as effectively as those around the table, though I miss Amsterdam context and this beautiful place of the Bali so much. So thank you again for having me. So first of all, with regards to identity and culture, I would like to start off by saying that though myself, I'm coming basically from the cultural studies background as a university teacher and also as a person who has been running the cultural institution since 2008. But at the same time, I think under the current conditions, I just have no right, or I just cannot pretend that I'm still within some cultural framework at the moment. Just because cultural life in a cultural field, even in a usual public sense, unfortunately was finished on the 24th of February this year. And I'm basically very privileged to join you today because I still have light here and running water and pretty good internet connection, as you see, unlike my millions of my compatriots. And that's only possible only thanks to the Ukrainian military who are keeping the front line in the south, in the east and in the north of Ukraine. But also I think this is very much applicable to you as well, to this honorable gathering. Because if not the Ukrainian military, I think you in Amsterdam would also face a bit different urgency at the moment. And perhaps not speaking about Europe's Day, but a bit different perspective, I would say. So in that regard, if we are like discussing this kind of cultural perspective or identical perspective or cultural deal, as you call it, for Europe, as far as Ukraine is concerned in this regard, I would say that it's, yeah, though I'm coming from the cultural field myself, I would say here that culture is basically not enough, especially with regards to Ukraine, because it's rather about not only cultural, but also economic, political, social, institutional, energy, one big all-encompassing deal for Ukraine. Because I think that's already, if not today, then when, that the EU should basically and finally put a full stop to end this constant foot dragging with regards to Ukraine and finally recognize Ukraine in a legal, literal sense as part of the European Union. That would be the most helpful gesture from the side of the Union under the current catastrophic conditions. And I'm speaking this really very literally, though I don't represent the state, of course. But at the same time, just some several points also to mention, because today is Europe Day, but as we know, it's coming after the commemoration day, like yesterday, right? And I think it's especially this year, unfortunately, that we have to sort of face the obvious in front of this war catastrophe and say that it's not just these sort of populist, divisive forces or narratives which are working against our common future that you already discussed, though they do exist and they do work against our common future. But we have to also to recognize and to acknowledge that it is exactly the Europe's mainstream, the core of Europe, that has failed, unfortunately. So we have to answer honestly to ourselves this basic question: why Europe's never again, which has been a basic stone of the Union since 1945, basically, I mean, in prospect, hasn't worked out? Why only again that remain today? And how could European Union allow this to happen again? And now it's being threatened by fascism again. Only this time it's coming from the Russian state side, not from the German side. And also in this regard, let's not forget, and I think this is a crucial moment to take into account, that it's not by occasion that the Kremlin used the terminology of denazification and demilitarization to absurdly justify its war against Ukraine. It's not by occasion, because it has been deliberately repurposing the vocabulary which had referred to Nazism defeat to legitimize, on the one hand, its own fascist military dictatorship, but on the other hand, this is exactly aimed at to repurpose the Nazism defeat, because this is the only event which allowed the European Union to come to existence. Because without this Nazism defeat, European Union would simply be impossible. So I think that's why, exactly why this war is not just against Ukraine, but against Europe as such, because everything that the Russian Federation is doing at the moment is not just, it is hitting Ukraine as a soft spot of Europe, but it is the European Union which allows this to take place. But everything that the Kremlin is doing is exactly aimed at dismantling the institutional order, legal categories, and political practices that the European continent at large has been based on since the end of the Second World War. So I think let's also, I'm sorry, but let's be in a way blunt here.
Please.
Because European, the idea of United Europe, but also United Europe as such, as a political phenomenon, should have tackled this already earlier. And this existential, really, in a very literal sense, challenge, which has been unseen for decades. But what we have seen instead, after the full-scale invasion, because I'm saying full-scale because the war itself has been going on for already 8 years. And the Netherlands know this very well, because we, with Ukraine, you and we share victims in the same war. I mean, of course, MH17 Malaysian airplane. So, I mean, what instead we saw that the European Union, unfortunately, just resorted to some miserable trading. We all know these rhetorics, right? We can give you only 7 tanks, not 10, because if we give you 10, it would be seen as a kind of an escalation by the Kremlin. This is just a really very tragic moment, I think, just because the European Union still behaves as if this war is somebody else's war, as if it's not a European war. And this can lead to a really very tragic moment in a very literal sense, because it can end up in total moral bankruptcy of the European project. That's what I'm afraid of. Because, you know, we all know, of course, especially in Ukraine, we learned that this, no NATO intervention argument. We know this nuclear blackmail imposed by the Russian Federation and so on. But let's, for a moment, for instance, project the current Ukrainian realities, for instance, on the Netherlands. I'm also saying that because the Netherlands had the experience with Rotterdam, right, in the context of the Second World War. So just imagine that, for instance, on the everyday basis, and I'm not speaking metaphorically, unfortunately, that on the very everyday basis, you discover mass graves with tortured and killed Dutch people around Amsterdam. That instead of Utrecht, which is 70% ruined, you have a kind of a huge filtration camp. Yes, I'm not exaggerating. That's exactly the term they use today, a filtration camp, where in order to survive, people have, and in order to get some food, people have to gather corpses of their neighbors and put them into mobile crematoria, because the occupants want to hide evidences of the mass massacres that they conducted. And imagine that, I don't know, that Groningen is 70% or 90% ruined by bombardments, and almost doesn't exist at all. So in this sense, you know, obviously what we learned that for many reasons, some of them were already mentioned today by our honorable colleagues. But this is obvious, and we learned this in Ukraine, that the European Union as a force, simply for military reasons, for other reasons, has no courage to directly step in and prevent further atrocities. Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you, and you're right, it's difficult to interrupt a discussion from outside if you're on the Zoom, so that's why I let you talk for a while, because you are absolutely right, it's difficult to join into a conversation from that side. But you're making these are my words, but if I can put your words into, you're making a very strong point that in a way, this war proves the bankruptcy of the European project, because we're no longer able to provide peace and to defend the core values on which the European project was built. And so it's targeted not only at Ukrainian citizens and at the Ukrainian state, but at the core idea, you would say, of the European Union. Maria, if I can have you come into the conversation. If you listen to Vasil and his maybe cry from the heart and cry from the depth, de profundis, unmasking, you could say, of what we are as Europeans. What would be your take on the fact that this war maybe or might be proving the bankruptcy of the whole idea of Europe? I can go to others
words,
first.
of course, and I'm going to trust on your understanding about that. And of course, from 24th of February onwards, but long before that, I've been trying to find ways how to navigate between some sort of utopianism of hope and negativism of despair. So, together with my students, I was trying to build a vocabulary, some sort of terminology that would help us understand what is to be done, what can we do as artists, as intellectuals, as culture practitioners, that is meaningful at this very moment. We came with a number of terms, but I think the most important to replace both hope and despair was the word disillusionment. And we came across a positive definition of the word disillusionment by Rebecca Solnit, who suggested that we need to move forward without illusions. Because I think the European project has been some sort of an illusion. And I think it was said here with different, slightly more hopeful vocabulary or dictionary, but I think we need to take this notion of disillusionment as a possibility, a small opening, small interstice for us, before us, to move forward, but then without illusions. We need to land back into reality and ask that intense question, now what? And of course, in the art field, I tend to think in two temporalities. One is the immediate temporality, which I name resistance. We need to resist, we need to organize, and do whatever is possible. Organizing help, organizing funds, organizing place for people to stay. Organize. But with that, we also need to organize knowledge about the current situation. I'm not necessarily sure that we need one European narrative. I think every big narrative is a potentially dangerous narrative. But I think we need to quite seriously rethink how we think about ourselves. Our complicity in the situation, not just European Union, but of course Europe. I think those two terms shouldn't be used interchangeably. But to think our complicity in the current situation, in past and present colonialism, imperialisms, and what have you. Because when we talk about Europe, we tend to throw a blind eye on less than positive realities, and forget to think about the fact that when you say Europe, at some places of the world, people understand colonialism. And I think we need to dig again through this sort of histories and find again new vocabulary through which we can narrate histories and imagine futures. Speaking of which, through my education, I understood that the colonial discourse and the discourse of imperialism could not be applied on Russia. I learned otherwise. I think.
When you were at school, you mean?
At school, yeah. In then communist Czechoslovakia. But even recently, Oleksiy Radinsky, who is a Ukrainian filmmaker, who was Bach Fellow in 2019-2020, I remember when he presented his project, he said we need to talk about decolonizing in respect to Russian.
The Russian Empire, the Russian colonial.
I was very doubtful, and just 3 days before war, we exchanged emails, and he wrote me quite literally. These days, I often think back to our brief conversation about decolonial thinking in the context of Russia and Ukraine, whether its application could be possible, whether it is applicable. And I guess it would be much easier for you to understand and prove now that it is. And so what we have is
and what would have been your answer, or what was your answer?
My answer, maybe not verbally, but in terms of
yeah.
action, was to actually study the notion of colonialism in relation to Russia. And I arrived in extraordinary findings. Specifically the writings of US scholar Kimberly St. Julian Varnon, who is talking about colonialism of course, Tsarist Russia, etc., etc. And I think we don't take this seriously. As to, again, education, this was mentioned here, how we teach ourselves and our children about this. And so I leave the resistance part here, but it's really urgent and now, and we need to really deal with it. But I think in the field of culture, there's another temporality. The question is, when is what urgent? I think you presented it, it doesn't feel urgent, and I agree.
But we also talk about, we all talk about Europe here, and then as a Ukrainian, it's very hard to be here. Now we talk about Ukraine as part of Europe. We are not part of the European Union. We can't freely move here. It's extremely difficult to be mobile, to work here, to come here for projects, even without a war. So yeah. It feels not inclusive towards places outside of the European Union, which you consider Europe.
To be honest, it's kind of weird, in fact, our discussion, in a sense that we're talking...
Why?
Because we're talking about a country in emergency. I mean, we're talking about a country which is attacked. I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of deaths every day, torture. And on the other hand, we're talking about European culture, how we could speak about a European education and a neurotic Europe. I mean, we're talking about two temporalities completely different. I mean, one is a full emergency, which is an historical emergency.
Yeah.
And the other one is something we've been talking about without being heard, in fact, for years or even decades. And the gap between the two is extremely strong. I mean, I think everyone can feel it.
But
somehow.
if I interpreted you right, I'm going to Vasil and then to you, Maria. Vasil, I saw your remark, and thank you for pointing this out. But if I'm interpreting you right, there is a huge connection between the fact that we didn't look upon the reality of our history, upon the history we have been living through about imperialism, colonialism, Second World War, the darker sides, and the fact that we're not able, at least that's how I'm interpreting what you're saying, we're not able to recognize that this emergency is coming from the fact that we have imagined ourselves to be born in 1950, to use the Benedict Anderson phrase, imagined communities, but we imagined it started in the 50s. And there is, if I interpreted you right, there is a connection between those very real emergency and those very real idea of what Europe is about. Vasil, at least that's how I'm experiencing what you're saying, but I might be interpreting too much. Vasil, please.
Yeah, thanks. Just a short note with regards to colonialism, what Maria mentioned. I mean that let's not forget that these, because it's very much also about these two realities that Olivia mentioned as well. Because let's not forget that for the last centuries, Ukrainian culture has been not just placed in the Russian imperial shadow, but has been simply robbed of its heritage and modern actuality and forcefully provincialized. And all that till now has been done with the full support and acceptance of the West, which is now very willing to follow a decolonial trend, but is totally blind on the matter outside its own bubble, as it was towards its own past not long ago. And now what we see, that Ukrainian museums and cultural sites are looted and deliberately destroyed by the Russian military, the vanguard force of Russian cultural colonialism. And as for these two realities that Olivia mentioned, I think they overlap a lot. Because let's not forget that it's pretty like the situation that United Europeans are observing the unbearable in Ukraine, hiding behind the European wall, because the Berlin Wall didn't fall. It just gained another form, as we know. So here is the question. It's not even about only Ukraine, but how this observing of the unbearable affect your society. What does it do to the condition of the Western democracy? What kind of democratic society we can claim or we can get as an outcome if continuous war disasters always appear not unbearable enough to directly act and stop them?
Thank you.
So if we really think,
Thank you, Vasil. I'm going to cut you short.
Okay.
Maria, you were saying...
Yeah, I wanted to say that regarding the two temporalities, if the immediacy requires resistance and radical action, I think that other temporality, my proposal would be to shift from resistance to re-existence. And this is where the space of art without illusion, so this is not utopianism of hope, but it's quite realistic thinking about how things are, imagining how they could be otherwise, and then doing everything possible to accommodate that imaginary. And that imaginary could and should be about what that other notion of democracy needs be actually in this current circumstances. So this is where in the space of art, I think there is a toolbox that could and should be implemented and offered. But again, it's to a great extent contains learning, contains learning with one another. It's not a single narrative, it's multiple narrative, it's not an individual, it's not an independency, it's interdependency, which we recognize within this space of re-existence, kind of pre-enacting another world. I think this is the only way, and it sounds very dreamy, and I don't mean it like that, but I think we need to operate these two possibilities at the same time, resistance and re-existence. What cannot be imagined cannot be built. And I think this is what we need to take very seriously in our field.
So all of you raising a finger, Sophia.
It was kind of floating, and there was many thoughts. No, we just you mentioned that we were talking about European culture, and we talk about country at war and emergency, but we're not talking about how can we help Ukrainian culture community, which is, Vasil has mentioned, does not exist because of the state. But there's still people, there's still artworks, there's still museums which are looted, which are bombed, which are completely destroyed. There are artists who used to earn their money and their living with producing works and projects and then cannot do this anymore. And then how do we implement it? How do we implement European solidarity for culture sector? For people who actually need it, who need to be recognized here, who are now moved away from or as Vasil, they are still in Ukraine, and they need support. And we're not talking about this. We're not talking about immediate actions of how we can help this particular people. And if we're talking about culture sector, this is what we all do, how we can help the same sector in a country which is at war, which is a European country at war. And how we can save those museums, save those artworks, make sure they don't get destroyed, at least try to protect it and try to protect people who are involved in this. So yes, if you have any...
But you already presented before our talk, you've done lots of fundraisers, because this I don't know whether this can be talked about in general terms.
Yeah.
There's enormous solidarity going on. It's never enough. But you yourself did a couple of fundraisers.
Yeah, we did collect money for Museum Crisis Center, which helps museums and to evacuate artworks. Also, Ukrainian Emergency Art Fund. Yeah, we were doing a fundraiser W139 last month. But still, it's not enough, as you're saying. And it's still, as one was still saying, that there's no culture anymore. It's not important anymore. But there's still people who need this, who need support.
But if I can add something to this terribly difficult discussion, so it's really one of the toughest that I've ever participated in, and that's also because of what Olivier was saying. I mean, the plans are too different. But one thing I'm sure of is that culture is at the center of this war. And that it's a mistake for artists or people involved in culture to think that, you know, now it's maybe not the time for that, and it's difficult to be in culture in this moment because there are more urgent things. I think, I mean, this was a war that was declared by a rambling historical speech reconstruction by Putin, who kind of declared war by kind of rambling on about Ukrainian history, and when we look at Putin and the wars he's led before, culture has always been important and strategic in the way he operates. If you remember Syria, if you remember Palmyra, and how important Palmyra was. I mean, Palmyra was a place that was taken by ISIS in 2015, and they beheaded 25 foreign fighters there and started destroying like some of the monuments, and Putin put a huge kind of like fire power into retaking Palmyra and staged a Mariinsky theater concert in 2016 in the Palmyra theater, and he gave a speech there remotely. And then it was taken again by ISIS. And if you look at Ukraine, of course, I mean, we've seen what happened in Mariupol with the bombing of the theater, and this incredible thing that the blue shields that were actually decided in the Hague Convention in 1954. You know, the idea was that even in war, you would, I mean, participating. Of course, I don't have to say it to you, but that you would be able to protect monuments and culturally significant heritage sites by putting a blue shield on it so that it wouldn't get destroyed and targeted. These blue shields are now, I mean, they're making it more of a target. I mean, if you put a blue shield on a monument or a site in Ukraine nowadays, you can be sure that it would be targeted doubly by the Russians. And so this, I mean, this also shows how important this component is. And again, we're unprepared for this, you know, so we're still putting blue shields because that's our mentality, but we will need to snap out of this really fast.
I think you have one closing remark, and then I'm going to the last panel. I promised 3 panels.
Yeah, sure. No, just very quickly to this idea of imperialism. I think it's very important, and this is, I think, one of the main reasons between the schism between the eastern part of Europe and the western part of Europe. That the western part of Europe never wanted to understand that behind this idea of socialism, it was pure Russian imperialism. And this is something that we never really wanted to fully recognize. And I was in Bratislava, for instance, 2 weeks ago, and I was with a Slovak writer of the anthology. And he told me the story of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in Bratislava in '63. And they were expected by the students because they were stars and philosophers and from the free world. And what Sartre and Beauvoir told these young people, they have to work harder on real socialism, le socialisme réel. And there was a full mistake of misinterpretation between the West and the East. That's one thing. And I think that especially in Western Europe, the intellectuals never really wanted to understand how the people of Eastern Europe suffered so much because of Russians and because of communism. That's one thing. The other thing, very quickly, that we're talking about a culture war. What is the culture of Europe since the war? It's a culture of memories. I mean, Europe is the only continent which has been working on its memory like that. I mean, digging and digging and digging and digging, recognizing its crimes. I mean, the fascists, the colonialists, and so on and so on. Russia has done exactly the opposite. It completely reinvented its history. I mean, there was never any crime under Stalin. There was never any crime under the Soviet Union. There was not even Chernobyl. And this is a complete reinvention of history. So on one part of the continent, you have a full recognition of memories, which is also something which is very difficult for us, I mean, as European people, in fact, to mobilize against something because we deconstructed so much of our history. And on the other hand, you have a country which became a full dictatorship, and as any dictatorship, which is reinventing its past to mobilize all its forces. And this is what's happening in Ukraine now.
Yeah, the specters of history and the sort of the undigested parts of history which coming back with vengeance to put it nicely, nip us in the bud, but it's much worse than that, of course. I think what we touched upon about how you can use culture and history to wage war or to not see that fascism is growing under your feet, or that it's, I think that's very important what we touched upon. I'd like to thank you all, the five of you, for this intense conversation. I think you're right, it's very, very, very difficult to talk upon these things while we're at war in this continent. It is even more honest and praiseworthy that you do actually, in the open, participate in a conversation like this. Thank you very much, all five of you. I'm going to move and ask you. I'm going to ask you to take one of the seats in the front row, and I'm going to move to the last panel. And because now we're moving into the realm of diplomats and to see. I'd like to introduce Gijs de Vries, Davy van der Weert, and Louis Vassy to take one of those three seats. Thank you very much for joining me. Gijs de Vries, a former Dutch politician, expert in the subject on international and cultural relations, senior visiting fellow at London School of Economics. Welcome. Davy van der Weert, Ambassador for International Cultural Cooperation in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome to you too. And Louis Vassy, French Ambassador to the Netherlands and a French diplomat, of course. So we have had an intense conversation on history and the sort of return of the whole cultural war which is raging in Europe, and maybe the démasque of the idea of Europe by the fact that we're not able to prevent anything happening like what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Maybe to start with you, Gijs de Vries, if I may. We've started out with 7 ideas for a European cultural recovery plan. We've gone into sort of the depth of our history and the fact that we have not touched upon our colonial history, maybe misinterpreted the colonial history of the Russians, not looked upon our own colonial history. If you listen to this, do you think that we, for a long time, we underperformed in Europe by attending to our cultural heritage and our cultural possibilities?
I think we certainly underperform. If I may pick up Giuliano's point, who reminded us of Putin's concert in Palmyra. Mm-hmm. He has a clear political view of culture. We should have a similarly political view of culture. And the starting point then is now to reach out to the Ukrainian artists who have had to leave their country or who are still in the country without being able to work. There should have been already an integrated, coordinated European response, a cultural response to help these artists. There have been some initiatives. ECF has spent $1 million, wonderful, an excellent, really leadership initiative from the civil society. Germany has put aside $1 million, mostly for media people. France has put aside a fund, I believe, about $1 million. So there are a number of initiatives, but they are not tied up. And what bothers me about this...
So we might have 3, 4, 5 million and 100 billion for extra money for weapons by the Germans alone.
I think I stay out of that comparison because there's a lot to be said about apples and pears. But on the cultural point, what bothers me is that Europe has not learned from last year's experience in Afghanistan. When the Taliban took over in Afghanistan in August, many Afghan artists were forced to leave Afghanistan. Again, different European countries acted in different ways without there being a joint European coordination. The European Commission should have learned from that. It should have used its own policy paper of 2016 in which it said it wanted an external cultural policy of the European Union. Well, if ever there was an occasion for that, it is now. So the first thing that needs to happen now
because is to have that. Are destroyed in Ukraine because people are in direct need.
Precisely. The first thing is to reach out to people. The second thing is to help protect the stones. UNESCO has already said that about 43 major Ukrainian monuments have been damaged by the Russian attack. We need to help preserve what is left. And that also means more European coordination. Again, we have the same story, different countries do different things, but Europe doesn't act together. Why do I make that point? Not only because of the inherent importance of helping the cultural sector, but also because it would be a hugely powerful symbolic act for Europe to counter the Russian interpretation of culture by having our collective approach to help cultural people in need and to defend their cultural freedom. That is what the EU should be doing now as a priority.
Would you agree with Vasil Chiripanem that, in a way, this war, is a démasque of our whole European idea if we're not able to get our act together and defend citizens in Ukraine?
I think it was a bit of an overstatement.
Why?
Because there has never been, I'm going to agree with him in a minute on what he has said, but I'm going to disagree with him first. I think it's a bit of an overstatement to suggest that Europe hasn't done a thing. This is the first time that the European Union has granted military aid to a country outside the European Union. This is the most important and far-reaching sanctions package that the EU has ever agreed, and we're now finally going to talk about oil. We should have done that earlier, in my opinion, but finally that is happening. We're talking about, and this is the key point that has to happen now, the possibility of opening a membership perspective for Ukraine. I believe that should have happened already. I believe the European Union should have a more political response to the crisis in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the rule of law, for liberty, for the right to determine their own future. Those are European values. Those are the absolute core European values of the European Union. They are fighting for our values. And the least we can do in moral terms is to reach out to Ukraine, which has earned its right to open membership negotiations with the EU. We still need, obviously, to insist on conditions that have to be met. Ukraine has to reform economically. It has to reduce its levels of corruption, which before the war were very, very impressive. It has to strengthen its rule of law. But we need to embark on a massive program of assistance for Ukraine to help that process along. Meanwhile, I think, and this is the critical challenge for the EU beyond Ukraine in an immediate sense, because democracy is at risk in this war, this also offers an opportunity for the EU to rethink its own democratic model, to rethink how we can strengthen the democracy in the European Union as it exists today, by taking the situation in Hungary much more seriously, for example, but also by taking the anger of so many young Europeans more seriously. Half of the British young people did not vote in the last British general election. There's deep disenchantment with democracy in Europe. Many young French people did not participate in the presidential vote. There was an opinion poll done by, or research done by University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands last year about what Dutch young people in schools think about democracy. 49% of Dutch young people think democracy is not important to them. Those are shocking figures. So this is an opportunity, this crisis, for the EU also to embrace its own democratic heritage and to revitalize the democratic foundations of the EU and the member states. It's a huge opportunity for Europe, this crisis. It's probably the most important moment in European history since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
And just so happens that the French are in the presidency in the most important moment. Would you, Louis Vassy, would you agree that we need a foreign cultural policy?
Look, first of all, well, that's I'll get to your question, but in a way, I don't really think that's the main question right now. I think we need to create, before having an external cultural policy, we need to also know what we stand for from a cultural standpoint or from a values standpoint as a body, let's say.
And the body is a European Union
as a European Union body.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think, as you know, under our presidency, we've decided even before the start of the conflict in Ukraine to have these three pillars presidency, the third one being the issue of belonging. And how do you, in fact, define Europeanness or togetherness in the context of the European Union? There, a lot has been said, frankly, in the first two panels, so I don't want to repeat what has been said very ably by the previous speakers, but I have to say that I am, frankly, strongly in the camp of those that think that we need a European narrative. Why is that? Because if you don't have a common narrative, a common vision of what you stand for and where you come from, by the way, including looking into the dark pages of your history, but not necessarily only these pages. I have to say that coming from France, for example, I have a difficulty with the notion that we have never visited the dark pages of our history. I mean, I am now old enough, 42, that I was at school 30 years ago, and I remember vividly having history lessons about the occupation, collaboration, in the Algeria War, colonialism. I mean, this notion that Europe doesn't revisit its history, at least doesn't frankly apply to my country, I would say, and I don't think it applies necessarily to many countries in Europe. I would certainly agree with, I think it was the point made by Olivier Guez, that we are certainly the cultural space that looks into itself, let's say, the more. I mean, I'm not aware that the Chinese have a very particularly profound soul-searching about their history. I don't think the Turks look into the Ottoman Empire with the notion that it's been colonizing half of the Mediterranean, for example. So in a way, this is part of us, but it's not the only part of us, and we need to also define, I think it's the point also made by Luc van Middelaar in many of his recent articles, we need to be able to define ourselves and define the common narrative that binds us together. And there are, frankly, as has been said, many foundations to do that. There is a historical aspect, there is a cultural aspect, there is a landscapes aspect, as has been said.
Lieux de mémoire.
There are lieux de mémoire that are European, including, by the way, outside of the European Union. When I went to Kiev only one time in 2017, I believe, or 18, I visited Babi Yar, the site where the Jews of Kiev had been massively assassinated, and I felt it was completely part of the European history, of course. So we need to be able to do that. At the same time, and that's where we differ from the Russians and the consult in Palmyra, we need to do it, and that's where it's more complicated, without negating ourselves. We are democracies, and so it's not going to be the role of the state or state-sanctioned authorities to define that narrative. So that's why, I guess, under our presidency, we've been pushing not so much for being the ones that define the narrative, but maybe seeing our role as creating the safe space so that others, civil society, intellectuals, historians, philosophers, writers, artists, are able to contribute to the definition of what we are as Europeans. And of course, in the end, hopefully, as has just been said, we will also end up with a definition that is deeply rooted into a values-based Europeanness, the ability to discuss issues and debate and exchange ideas, freedom of expression, individual freedoms and autonomy, capacity to democratic institutions, capacity to regulate our disagreements through dialogue and democratic institutions. All that is, of course, part of us. That's not exclusively European, though. You have these notions, for example, in Northern America also. So I guess what we add also as Europeans is a sense of solidarity. And I think that's indeed, as has been said, what's at stake when we look at the Ukraine crisis. It's or the war in Ukraine, it's our ability and the extent to which we are able to act in solidarity with the Ukrainians. Once we have done all that, I guess we'll be ready to have an external cultural policy. Before that, I find it difficult because we won't know what we will be promoting. And I think we need first to be to understand what we stand for, where we come from, and what we are.
That could take a while, of course.
No, I think maybe I've been too long, but a last point. If we don't define our narrative ourselves, others will define us from the outside. The Russians know what we are in their view. We are a band of degenerate, weak people that are unable to sustain pressure and war. So they have a definition and a narrative about ourselves. The Chinese have a narrative about ourselves. They were very clear during COVID. We are people people difficult to rule, not abiding by regulations, not acting according to regulations, and because of that we are declining. So people from the outside have actually a narrative about ourselves, and if we don't take back control of our narrative as Europeans, I think we leave this huge space from the outside for others to be defining us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe from the inside as well, the nationalists we talked about.
That's a point that was done previously, but I would add that from the outside there is a strong pressure to define what we are as Europeans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. By the Chinese or the Russians? Or
the Chinese, for example, during the COVID crisis had this incredible thing that they were pushing all the stories in which there was mismanagement of the COVID crisis. For example, at some point they created a story that older people had been abandoned in the care houses in France, to the point that we had to summon the Chinese ambassador to Paris to ask him to stop, basically spreading fake news about France. So that exists, basically. It comes from the outside. The Russians do it more than the Chinese, I would argue, but still it's very present. And if we don't define what we are, if we don't say we are democratic, we act in solidarity, we have a history, good and bad, we will let others take control of our narrative.
I'm going to push my luck and ask Davy van der Weert the same thing in a way. But in the meantime, there's real need in Ukraine. And though I do understand the point, of course, that it's important to know what you're going to represent, and as a diplomat you would probably also agree with Louis Lassie. But in the meantime, we've spoken to artists, and there is this horrible bombardation of the Stones, and not the Rolling Stones, but the churches and monuments in Ukraine, and the artists. Shouldn't we, in the meantime, we have sent a few howitzers to a few cannons as Holland to as the Netherlands to Ukraine. Shouldn't we, in the meantime, have an emergency policy on? Should have learned from Kabul. Should we be going that direction?
I mean, I fully agree with you that we should, and it is actually also happening on the ground. And I agree with Gijs de Vries that maybe we could have thought about this, let's say, in a more focused way as a European Union before. But within the EU and with UNESCO and different organizations in several EU countries, we are actually working very hard in Ukraine on securing. Helping to secure, let's say, heritage, trying to bring certain works to safety, packing things. There have been a lot of actions to bring material actually to have very practical assistance, and working with a lot of organizations, artists, institutions on the ground, and also, in fact, supporting artists. And of course, there have been huge numbers of artists fleeing also to European countries, and actually many different countries are having all kinds of initiatives of, for example, in The Hague we are supporting a Ukrainian dance company at Amare. They're going to be hosted. So there's many of these different initiatives going on, but it's maybe not that visible. There is also a coordination, actually. So the different partners that are working on that are trying to do that as much as possible in cooperation and together with the main Ukrainian actors. But yeah, it's of course a crisis and a very complicated situation in which you can never do enough. And I think, yeah, one of the things that we keep underestimating is, in fact, that these objects are real targets, and so we need to really also try to think steps ahead. And I heard, for example, discussions about artists that were saying we would like to have our work saved in the cloud for if something happens. Mm-hmm. Well, we have also seen here in Holland that several media outlets from Russia are now operating from out of the Netherlands. There is, of course, also the aspect of Russian artists and art directors that have also fled their countries and that also need our support. Yep. So yes, I fully agree that we really need to act, and I think it is also happening. But yeah, it is a very complicated situation because it's moving so fast and changing all the time. And what we will surely also need to do, and there's actually also a lot of thought about that already, is at some stage to look ahead at a build-up phase again, and how can we, as Europe, assist Ukrainians in a time when it will be possible to look at reopening and renovating heritage, etc. And there's actually also a lot of thought about that, and also documenting what is actually currently being destroyed as part of that, but also documenting that for accountability reasons, to make sure that afterwards we can also very clearly say this is what has happened and who should be held accountable for that.
Mm-hmm. I think this whole crisis invites all Europeans to think bigger, to ask some really big existential questions about who we are and who we want to be and what we are willing to do to get there. There is a certain self-evidence about how the European Union has been a success so far. And indeed, it has been a huge success in terms of the peace between France and Germany, the fact that the EU has allowed Germany to unify peacefully, the fact that we've taken on board former dictatorships in Spain, in Greece and in Portugal. I can go on and on and on. The enlargement with many countries that have formerly been communists, huge historic achievements. But we cannot mentally rest on these laurels. There is a new agenda. And that agenda first means to defend democracy where it is now at risk. And that is a cultural and ideational challenge that we have to come up against. So that means making Ukraine a success. We have to do everything to help Ukraine, to make Ukraine a success as a democratic, free, and prosperous nation. Not only because of our values, but also because of our interests. Because if we do that with the Ukrainians, if we help Ukraine to become that success, that is our best way to influence Russia. Do not forget why Russia has invaded Ukraine in 2014, why it occupied the Crimea. That was in revenge for Ukraine agreeing an association agreement and a trade agreement with the European Union. Ukraine was looking for a way to move west. And that posed an existential challenge to Putin, because Putin knows that a successful Ukraine, a free and democratic Ukraine, a European Ukraine, will work as a magnet on reformers in Russia and will strengthen the hand of reformers in Russia. And that is one of our main self-interests as Europeans. We have never had a good geopolitical answer to the challenge posed by Russia in Europe. Who are we and how do we see Russia? Well, here we have an opportunity to work with Ukraine, first in the interest of Ukraine, but secondly in the interest of peaceful, democratic developments in our continent over the next couple of decades. That is the challenge. But that means the European Union will also have to look inward and reform itself. This is a huge opportunity to take care of unfinished business in the European Union. I've mentioned the strengthening of democracy. But we also need to think of the countries in the Western Balkans who have applied to join the EU. What are we going to tell them? If we want to take in the 10 countries that have now applied for membership, that will kill decision-making in the Council of Ministers, unless we reform that decision-making process, unless we abolish or reduce the use of the veto in the Council of Ministers, so that one small country cannot block the will of all the others, as has happened regularly. For example, in the latest instance with Cyprus, blocking our sanctions on Lukashenko in Belarus because we didn't follow the Cyprus line on Turkey. That sort of nonsense has to stop. We need to reform the way the European Union works. And we probably also have to build in some new steps between full membership and non-membership. This membership path takes 10 years. It took Croatia a decade to join the EU. That system doesn't work. We have lost our influence over the Balkans because the system takes too long. So we need some intermediate steps. And I think that is why we need to reform the European Union, to build in those intermediate steps, to strengthen decision-making, and to strengthen the cohesion of the European Union in economic policy, in defense policy, in energy policy, in environmental policy. A stronger, more effective, more democratic union in order to face up to the challenges of the continent. That is the challenge that we face now, and I think, therefore, we need to have a more ambitious view and aim higher.
I think I'm going to leave it at that, because we've talked for 2 hours, and that's been long enough. We've listened to a variety of point of views. We've listened to a wonderful introduction by Princess Laurentien, and I just want to read out, I'm not going to summarize everything we've been saying. I'm just going to read out the wonderful quote by Lech Wałęsa. The sole and basic source of our strength is the solidarity of people who seek to live in dignity, truth, and harmony with their conscience. I think if we adhere to that, and I think you are much in agreement with Vasil Hiropanem that this is a moment in which the whole European project is challenged, and that we need to realize, what it actually means from a value point of view, what we're doing here. Take our democracy serious, take our history serious, take our cooperation serious, and take the agenda serious. I've overdone my welcome by 7 minutes. I apologize to you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for participating, everybody here on the table. Thank you for cooperating with the European Cultural Family.